So in the last few videos, we've talked a lot about divine simplicity. We've talked about the nature of God, thinking of theology proper in the traditional sense, which is that God as God. And this has brought up a lot of different interesting things that we've been able to encounter already. We've talked about the relationship between being and goodness, the relation between essence and existence, and how these are actually the same thing in God. But at this point, I wanted to take a brief pause and actually address a common critique that's engaged towards Christian theology that begins to take this traditional and classical route. And this oftentimes comes into place when we begin asking questions about how does this work with the incarnation? And indeed, this has already become a major theme of our class as we've begun to talk and work through questions of divine simplicity. As we had the Quod Libet the other day, one of the biggest things that was waged against the aspect of divine simplicity pertains to the complexity, that is the multiple parts, which are seen in Jesus Christ. And so we might think that there's a problem of competing syllogisms that might go something like this. In the previous weeks, I laid out the argument for divine simplicity, which would say that if X is composite, then X depends on its parts for existence. That's the first premise. The second premise would be if X is dependent on its parts for existence, then X does not exist in and of itself. And then the third part, which would be the conclusion of those, just a hypothetical syllogism, would say, therefore, if X is composite, that is, if something is composed of parts, then X, that same something, does not exist in and of itself. And then we say, but God does exist in and of himself. Therefore, God is not composed of parts, which is just taking that first minor conclusion and adding it to another premise, which says that God exists in himself, which is the essence and existence claim. And there you have another conclusion, which would say that God is ultimately simple. Once again, though, students tend to get a little squirmish when they start thinking of the incarnation. And the reason is not a bad reason, because it might go like this. We could say, okay, that's an interesting argument. And it certainly seems like it works. But I have another argument for you. And that argument would say, if Jesus is fully God and Jesus is composite, then God is composite. And I say Jesus is fully God. Therefore, God is composite. What's wrong with that? And I think that's an interesting point to make, right? Because we want to say that Jesus is fully God. And we even want to make sure that we can, in some sense, use language that we talk about Jesus to really and truly make claims about God. So we say Jesus is this, therefore God is this. And so you might see these two different syllogisms, as you were, these two different arguments, one for simplicity and one for a composite nature of God, to be in competition towards one another. And I think that's a pretty astute observation if you're making something like that. And I would say most of you are making something similar to that, even if it's not as fully fledged as that. But notice what this argument's doing and what it's not doing. It is not saying that there's a problem with the divine simplicity argument. It's simply saying that I'm more convinced of the Jesus being composite and fully God argument. And since I'm more convinced of that, even though I don't know what's wrong with the divine simplicity argument, something's got to be wrong with it. And it's important to recognize that that is the reason that people begin to offboard this thesis. And the reason that's important to diagnose in that way is because if there's something wrong with that Jesus composite God argument, then ultimately we don't actually need to lose the divine simplicity argument. We can recognize that there may be a possible way of making sense of both of these claims. And indeed, we see in Christian history that there is an attempt to do something like this. So in the 400s, there's questions of what do we do with claims that we make about Jesus Christ that don't seem to be possible for the divine essence himself. So, for example, we want to say that God is unchanging, and yet we recognize that Jesus grows, not only physically, but also grows in knowledge, according to the Gospel, according to St. Luke. We want to recognize that God is an eternal, necessary being, and yet Jesus dies. And so we really want to be able to say that God dies. And so what are we doing with these claims? What ends up becoming the highest point of contention, possibly, is the question of the mother of Jesus, right? We would say, okay, well, Mary is the mother of Jesus, but is this a worry for saying that Mary is the mother of God? Because as soon as you start saying Mary is the mother of God language, people begin to be a little bit worried that you're beginning to put Mary above God in some sense. And that's the historical route that this ends up developing. And you have figures like Nestorius, whose beliefs are rather difficult to actually pen down in and of himself. But he has been largely characterized as someone who adheres to Nestorianism, where it would get its name, which is the heresy that would ultimately say that we cannot actually connect the actions of Jesus Christ or the attributes of Jesus Christ with God. And this is a big heresy. The reason being is because it seems to suggest that God did not become man, as John chapter 1 would say. And so if you're wanting to say that Mary is not the mother of God, even though she's not the mother of Jesus, or even though she is the mother of Jesus, this would be a problem simply because when we read John's gospel, we say, no, God did become man. And so we have to be able to make sense of that. Now, the traditional way of doing this is exactly what the Council of Chalcedon does in 451 AD. And they declare, and I think they declare rightly, that when we say things of Jesus Christ and we say things of God, we need to do so keeping the hypostatic union in mind. Now, this is where I want to begin to recognize we're getting into second semester territory. And so we're going to come back and examine this more carefully. But for those of you who are wondering how this interacts with divine simplicity, this is basically the answer to that question. So Christ is himself divine. He is the divine essence, but he's also united to a human essence. One person, the person of the Son, two natures, or two essences, if you will, the divine and the human. Now, we want to say that the divine is the thing that ultimately subsists. That is, it is the thing that exists in itself. To use the analogy of the gray wall, it is the wall compared to the grayness of it. But the nature is able to exist in the divine essence, particularly in the person of the Son. And that means that unlike any other things that have ever existed, Christ, being the eternal Word of God, the unchanging Son, is able to unite himself to a human nature that does change. And so what this ultimately allows us to do is it allows us to say that any change that we want to posit of Jesus Christ happens not in his divine nature, but in his human nature. That being said, his human nature is really and truly united to his divine nature. But that union is such that we can't actually ascribe the change to God's divine nature, even though we can ascribe it to the person of the Son, who eternally subsists and who has a human nature, or is united to a human nature. And so when it comes down to that syllogism that I was mentioning earlier, where we want to say that Jesus, if Jesus is God and if Jesus is composite, then God is composite. The reason that syllogism doesn't work is ultimately because we have to recognize that when we are saying composite, we are making claims about the human nature of Jesus Christ and not the divine nature of Jesus Christ. When we are making claims about the unchangeableness of God or the simplicity of God, then we are making claims about the divine nature. That's very important to realize because it allows us to recognize that the divine nature itself is indeed simple, even if the human nature, which is assumed by Christ, is indeed composite. And so now no change is actually taking place in the divine nature, but only in the human nature. And so, of course, this is going to kind of push the question up against what in the world do we mean by a union then? And that, again, further is going to be something that we examine more closely in the second semester of this course. But I wanted to lay out more or less what's happening here, is that the second that you begin to say, hold up, we can't be making any claims about God that we ultimately can't make about Jesus, the man running around in Nazareth healing people. I would say not quite so fast, at least not in the traditional Christian understanding of that. Now, certainly some people, especially maybe since the late 19th century, have pushed back against the definition that I just offered, which is the same one that the Council of Chalcedon gives in 451. And they would say, actually, that's not what it means for God to become man. It means something a bit more radical, such that God changes into a different thing, which is not God and is actually man. This is an extreme articulation of something known as kenotic or kenotic Christology. Now, most adherents to this would not articulate it in the way that I just did, where you say that God becomes not God and becomes man instead. And they would adhere to something else that's more akin to the language that's used in Philippians 1 and 2. That being said, I think that it ultimately boils down to this claim, where you want to say that the incarnation actually is a fundamental change of God. Now, if you've been following this course quickly, you should see that that's quite alarming, because to even talk about God having the ability to change introduces potency in him. And if God has potency, then he's not simple, then he's not pure act, then his essence is not his existence, and ultimately that means he's not God. So I have some huge worries about these types of theses if you take them to their logical conclusion. But nonetheless, once again, that will be some more of the framework that we're going to be examining in the second semester. In this semester, it's only worth recognizing that even though we may have reasons for wondering about claims like divine simplicity and claims like God's essence and his existence and all of the various different offshoots that this is going to allow us to explore, it's worth constantly keeping in mind if our concerns are directly rooted in the argument itself about divine simplicity, or if they're rooted in something that we think is ultimately not possible given divine simplicity, which usually entails questions such as what about man being created in the likeness of God? What about the incarnation? Maybe even what about the Trinity? These are not technically arguments against divine simplicity, but they're arguments that would say, even if the argument for divine simplicity seems to work, I'm not as certain of it as I am the Trinity. And I think that's good, ultimately. I think that it's better that you are more certain of the Trinity and of the incarnation than you are of divine simplicity. But that being said, I don't think that's reason not to be certain in divine simplicity, even still. It's just reason to follow the course and the logic of this course to its extreme, to its full account, which will ultimately include things like from theology proper into Trinitarian theology, and then of course into Christology, which will lead naturally to questions of ecclesiology and our life as we experience the joy that is delighting in God, hoping for the realized beauty of being able to see him as he is in the beatific vision. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll let you think through where your pushbacks might be towards divine simplicity, and ask whether or not those are actually arguments with divine simplicity itself, or if they are arguments with things that you think might entail the falsity of divine simplicity. And if it's the latter, I would say hold those questions, hold on to them, and we'll see if they actually have merit when we get there.